We live in a media-saturated culture. More than ever, we depend on the media for our understanding of world events. But this media culture produces stories which are packaged to fit the imperatives of the market and the views and policies of those in power. Professor Franklin addresses issues of media influence, moral panics, and the increasing trend towards the government's management of the news. How have models of media influence evolved? Is the audience made up of passive consumers, or rather of discerning individuals who make critical choices?
Well, you're right to say that it's complex. It's something that's concerned media scholars for a good while, and the interest and the controversy goes back to 1920s when a guy called Walter Lippmann wrote an extremely influential book called Public Opinion, and he set a lot of hairs running, and what he wrote was highly controversial, and he saw the relationship between media and public opinion as one that allowed that was essentially propagandist in character, and Noam Chomsky and Ed Herman pick up on this in their book Manufacturing Consent. And what he said is that media create little pictures of reality in our minds, but they actually have nothing to do with the reality that's out there. It's very much a constructed reality. And if you look back across the 80 years or so since Lippmann was writing, you can identify at least 4 strands in the way that relationship between the media and public opinion has been theorized. It begins in the 20s and 30s with cinema and what's called the hypodermic model, or the magic bullets model. The idea was that media were very strong, that media messages were rather like a drug injected into the vein. They created a response, rather like the bell ringing for Pavlov's dogs. And so a media message, an image, created a response. That view it saw the audience as passive, receptive, uncritical, classically couch potatoes. We saw a message, we received it, it stimulated a response. It was very behaviourist, and although that view has died away, it still retains some credibility. And so we find during the 80s, when there were television reports of inner city riots, people spoke about television producing copycat riots, as if to show footage of that would send people off into the streets to conduct civil disobedience. Even the women's movement has argued about pornography, saying that it invokes a response, that it triggers men to sexually violent anti-women behaviour. That view died away, and in the 40s was replaced by a second view of that relationship, based around the work of some American scholars, Paul Lazarsfeld in particular, who wrote a book called The People's Choice, looking at the impact of media reporting of the presidential election in 40 and 44. And what he found is that instead of the media imposing messages on a passive receptive public, that people were critical. They read media texts critically. They rejected them, they selected them. And what was more important than the media message was interpersonal communication. And that communication was not a direct engagement between media and audience, but was stepped in at least 2 ways. So that media messages were received by opinion leaders, and then they were passed on to ordinary members of the public. And the credibility of that theory came back to me when I was looking at the way media report the general election in local newspapers and in local constituencies. And I was talking to one of the Liberal Democrat. He said they went round and saw what they called opinion leaders, postmen, people who worked in the corner shop, people who served behind bars, tried to persuade them to their view of the world, and these people in turn then passed it on to a wider audience, so that the message was stepped in at least 2 ways, and the influence of media was seen as much less. And then in the late 60s and 70s you have a third model. It's associated with J. Blumler and Elihu Katz, and the model is called the uses and gratifications. And the whole question and relationship between media and audiences is reversed, so that instead of saying how do media affect or influence audiences, the question becomes how do media use audiences? And Blumler and Katz say they use them in a number of ways to gratify basic needs they have, needs for entertainment, needs for information. And so the audience, and it's still quite a contemporary view, the viewer, the reader, becomes like a consumer, a customer, who goes into a televisual or media marketplace and selects those goods they want. They make conscious choices about the programs they want. It's a very market-driven model, and it draws on the same assumptions about viewers and readers as market theory does about customers. And then we move on to the era of good old Stuart Hall and the so-called cultural effects model in the 80s, and the famous encoding decoding metaphor, in which Hall reshapes the whole thing again, and Chas Critcher, of course, was centrally involved here. The key book marking this tradition of media effects was the Policing the Crisis book, in which they said media have powerful effects on their audiences, but these audiences are seemingly paradoxically involved in creating those messages. So instead of media being seen as an all-powerful transmitter of messages which the viewer receives, what Hall and Critcher and others were saying is that the media encode programs with certain messages, but these messages can be read quite differently, and the way in which they're read will reflect certain socio-economic and cultural characteristics of the viewer. So men may read it differently to women. Education, age, social class may all be factors which influence the way in which readers decode those messages. So media messages become mutually constructed. Audiences become collusive in creating, paradoxically, what they receive. So those are 4 trends. Another event that's worth talking about is the notion of moral panic, and this cropped up in the early 1970s with Stan Cohen's book, which my guess would be, on the usual scientific straw poll of 1, myself, is probably the most quoted book ever in the history of social science. It comes up again and again and again. And Stan Cohen had some very important things to say about the relationship of audiences to media and media messages. And again, Chas Critcher has written about those, I think, very helpfully in his recent book published this year. Do you want to